Hello, and welcome to the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence Public Advocacy course. We're going to be talking today about how you can be an advocate, how the coalition advocates, and how you can make a difference in the legislature. Now, before we dive in, just a little bit about myself. My name is Tanner Swanson. I'm an employee of the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, their public policy specialist, and my primary role is to work with legislators down at the Arizona State Senate and the Arizona House of Representatives to pass laws that further the interests of victims of domestic violence and sexual violence. I have a lot of experience. I was the past bill clerk for the Arizona State Senate, which means I managed legislation from when it was entered to when it was signed by the governor and chaptered by the Secretary of State. I also worked for John McCain for a short while and did a number of other jobs, including fundraising and communications. This course today is going to be taught in 3 parts. So first, we're going to learn about how the government works. We're going to get into the nuts and bolts of how the legislature gets its work done. Second, we're going to take a look at how public advocacy works, both from the perspective of someone who's directly lobbying, like myself, as well as everyday citizens and employees of nonprofits that benefit from good advocacy in regards to sexual and domestic violence. And then last, I'm going to give you some substantive tools that you can use in order to make a change yourself. So let's dive in. As promised, first up is how the government works, those nuts and bolts of how the legislature gets its work done. Similar to the federal government, the Arizona state government is broken up into 3 separate branches with their own powers. We have the executive branch, which has the governor and all of the administrative agencies under him. We have the legislative branch, which includes the Arizona House of Representatives and the Arizona State Senate. And then we have the judicial branch, which includes the courts. Now, the executive branch is responsible for enforcing laws. The legislature is responsible for passing and enacting laws. And then the judiciary is responsible for interpreting those laws. Each of these are very critical to the way that the Arizona state government functions, but we, for the purposes of this lesson, are going to focus on the legislative. And here it is, the Arizona legislature. In the legislature, there are 30 members in the Arizona State Senate, and in the Arizona House of Representatives, there are 60 members. Now, these members come from 30 districts all across the state of Arizona, with 1 senator and 2 representatives per district. Interestingly, the Arizona legislature is a part-time legislature, meaning that they only conduct their business for a portion of the year. Session will typically start the 2nd Monday of January and conclude within 100 days or so, ending in late April to early May on average, depending on when the chambers finish their business, however. Terms for senators and House representatives are 2 years, with the entire legislative body, both Senate and House, up for election. Now, interestingly, Arizona has term limits per chamber. Each member can serve up to 4 consecutive terms in a chamber before they are termed out. However, there is no limit for them to switch over to the other body, and those term limits are only for consecutive elections. So individuals and members can go between the state Senate and the state House of Representatives. Now, while this initial session is typically when the legislative body handles all of their normal business, there may be extreme circumstances in which what is called a special session needs to be called. Now, this can be called by the governor or the legislature. There's no specific timing for special sessions, and they occur intermittently to deal with specific issues or topics. For example, this year, there was a special session to address the COVID pandemic. There are no limits on the number of special sessions that may be called. However, these are not common. Now, as I said, there are 30 districts based on population across the state of Arizona, with 1 senator and 2 representatives representing those districts. Typically, you will see 1 to 2 senators running in a district, but upwards of 4, 5, or even 6 representatives running in a district, because the top 2 vote getters are the ones who will hold office. Unlike some states, interestingly, an independent commission draws the districts each census. We have an Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission that operates independent of the legislature to make sure that our districts are drawn fairly, not benefiting any party disproportionately. So to get an understanding of how the legislative body works, let's start at the very top with chamber leadership and how those power dynamics can influence the legislative process. Now, the House of Representatives is headed by the House Speaker, and the Arizona State Senate is headed by the Senate President. Both of these roles are very powerful positions. They are able to determine what the legislature in both houses will focus on, and they also are able to decide what committees certain bills will go to. Now, that's very important for two reasons. One is they can choose not to bring certain bills up for a vote at all. And in addition to that, they can choose to assign bills to committees, multiple committees, sometimes multiple committees to make sure that it doesn't get through, knowing that a committee will not pass a bill, sometimes assigning it only to one committee to make sure that that bill does get through. So their discretion and their ability to set the agenda for the legislature as a whole is very strong. Now, these legislative leaders are endowed with their powers through the rules. These are a not very often mentioned but very important part of the legislative process. Rules are adopted by each chamber at the start of the legislative session to create the structure by which legislators will conduct their business. And leadership in both chambers commonly determine changes to those rules, which might include what committees are currently able to function, what those committees are focused on, but these rules are very powerful in that they determine how the legislature conducts itself. Now that we have a firm grasp of the legislature and how it functions and its structure, let's go ahead and dive in to where the legislative process starts. Where do laws come from? Now, one of the most common answers that I get from people is they think that businesses, lobbying entities, government agencies, other interest groups are always the primary source of laws. Now, that's not entirely true. In fact, the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence very often relies on everyday citizens to bring up the issues that they're experiencing that they see as wrong or need to be improved. And then we bring it to the higher level of businesses, lobbying entities, and government agencies to get their support to pass those laws. And then one other place is other states that have had successful models of legislation. If we see California, Nevada, any other state doing something very, very well or something that greatly improved governance, we will take a look at implementing that same law in our state. But again, I want to make the point that it is everyday citizens seeking to improve their community that are really the rock solid foundation for how laws start. So before we get any further and dig into the individual parts of the legislative process, let's just get a nice little overview of it, and then we'll dig more into each step to give you a good understanding of how it works. Now, the first step after a law is introduced is to get a first and second read, which is essentially there to make sure legislators know what bills have been entered and what's coming up on the agenda. Now, after the first and second read, it will be assigned to a committee hearing by the leadership within each chamber, so the Senate President or the House Speaker. Now, many bills struggle to pass the committee level. They have to pass every committee before they get to the caucus that they've been assigned to. Now, the caucus is where the majority and minority party, the Republicans and Democrats, each separately meet and discuss what's coming up on the agenda for the committee of the whole or for a final vote. Here, they can ask researchers questions, they can ask other senators their position on it, and they can determine whether or not the bill will pass or not. It's a very important part for the legislature to make sure that they're on the same page. Now a bill is ready for the committee of the whole. The committee of the whole is the opportunity for the entire legislative body to consider a bill and vote whether or not to give it a final vote, and it's also an opportunity for them to add any last-second amendments before making a final vote. It's a very important part in the legislative process and gives an opportunity for the legislature to have more flexibility prior to a final vote. Now, if a bill passes the committee of the whole, it'll go on to a third read, which is the final vote before it goes over to the other chamber. So the Senate will send the bill over to the House, or the House will send the bill over to the Senate. And after that bill is transmitted, it goes through almost the same process in the other chamber. So let's say you're one of those everyday citizens who finds an issue in your community, wants to solve it, and you think that there's a specific law that could solve that problem. Well, the first thing for you to do is to find a legislature to sponsor your bill. Now, usually legislators have an area of preference that they like to work in. Now, that could be education, public safety, the environment, It could be any number of things, but it usually helps to find a legislator who cares about the issue that you want to do something on. Now, after you find a legislator to sponsor the bill, typically you can work with them and Legislative Council, which is a group of people who draft language so that you can get your idea actually into the Arizona Revised Statute, which is the set of statutes which makes up the law in Arizona. And they will be able to make sure that it's entered in such a way that it achieves the goal that you want without disrupting anything else in the statutes. Now, once you get your bill drafted, you will get an intro set, which is essentially a set of official papers that you can use to enter your bill. Now, on the intro set is a listing of all of the legislators in the legislative body, and you can go get signatures from them to have them be co-sponsors for your bill. And this is useful because it helps to show support for the bill, especially bipartisan support, which can be useful in making sure that a bill gets passed. And it also projects confidence that the bill will be able to pass if it gets further along in the process, because a lot of legislators will not want to bring up bills that don't have a likelihood of passing. So once you've secured the co-sponsors that you want, you can submit it to the hopper, which is essentially a folder, in the Secretary of the Senate or the Clerk of the House, and now your bill has officially been entered. The deadline for submitting these new bills is the 22nd day after the start of the session. Now, a few other details. Bills cannot be introduced by the governor, by state agencies, or any other person or organization. It is only legislators that can introduce a bill. There can also be sponsors of identical bills in both the Senate and the House, increasing the likelihood that a bill could pass. So congratulations, you got your bill entered, you went through all the steps. Well, now your bill will get a first and second read. And this is essentially a formality to ensure that all members know what legislation is being considered and to prevent that legislation from being forced through quickly. A fun fact about first and second reads, this was mandated due to the fact that many members in the early days of the state were illiterate and they needed to read the entire bills aloud for legislators to know what the bills were. So congratulations, your bill has now been entered, it's gotten its first and second read, and now it's assigned to committee after its second read by the leadership either in the House and the Senate, by the Senate President or the House Speaker. Now, whatever committees it's assigned to, that committee chairperson can now decide what to do with your bill. They can hear it and vote, they can hear it and do nothing, or they can not hear it at all. Now, a committee hearing is a public forum typically where individuals can come forth and testify, provide additional expertise, and answer any questions that individual legislators might have about the piece of legislation. Now, these committee hearings have pretty strict requirements about how they're conducted to make sure that the legislature is responsible and that senators or representatives are not surprised. So 5 days before a committee hearing, the chairman must distribute a public agenda announcing all of the specific bills to be considered, and amendments to those bills that are to be proposed within committee must be made available no later than 5 p.m. on the business day before the committee hearing. This makes sure that all the legislators know exactly what they're going to be considering within committee. Senate bills must be heard by their standing committees prior to the Saturday of the 60th day of the session. Now, this specific requirement means that bills have to be moved through quickly through the session, and that if they are not heard in committee by that 60th day, that they will not be heard and those bills are essentially considered dead. Important to remember is the Arizona State Legislature has what's called a strike everything amendment that can be done in committee or later steps in the process that we'll discuss. Now, strike everything amendment to existing bills means that they take out all of the existing language in it and put something entirely new in. It's pretty common for legislators to enter bills that have no intent of passing just to make sure that they can strike everything and put a new law in its place if it dies in committee or somewhere else for whatever reason. Now, these strike everything amendments have to be filed by a notice to the Secretary of the Senate's office or the House Clerk's office by 5 p.m. 2 days in advance and must be heard by a standing committee at a public hearing. Now, this is because strike everything amendments are very flexible and allow legislators to put laws in at a certain place in the legislative process very quickly. So they're very careful about using them because they don't want to abuse them. Now, once a bill passes all of the committees that it is required to successfully, it will go to one of two places. If the bill passed without any amendments as the original bill as it was entered, it will go into what's called the consent calendar, which is essentially a place where bills that are not controversial can sit and then be eligible for a third read without being considered in the committee of the whole. This is an important step to make sure that the committee of the whole doesn't have to consider many bills that the entire legislature agrees should be passed. However, at any time, a legislator can protest a bill on the consent calendar and require it to go through the committee of the whole. Now, the committee of the whole is a meeting of the entire body, the Senate or in the House, where they consider legislation that has been amended or rejected from the consent calendar by a legislator. The committee of the whole is an opportunity for the entire legislature to consider a bill, consider amendments to a bill, and then either pass or fail those bills as an entire body. It's an important part of the process which allows legislators to amend a bill. For example, some legislators will pass a bill clean through their committee without any amendments, but then want to amend it after it got out of committee and will object to it on the consent calendar and then amend it in the committee of the whole. It's a very important part of the legislative process. Now, during the committee of the whole, they typically operate by voice votes, which is to say that once a bill comes up for vote, everyone will either say aye or nay, and if it's all ayes, then the bill will pass. If the bill does not pass, then they will do a roll call vote, which will require every member of the body to submit their vote. There can also be called what is division, which is when a legislator feels that the committee chair of the committee of the whole did not hear the votes right, or if they want to force other legislators to go on the record as to how they voted, they can call division. After all bills are considered, the committee of the whole adopts a report of what happened, and then those bills are moved over to a third read. Now a bill is ready for a third read, whether it's coming from the consent calendar or from the committee of the whole. At this point, legislators will vote on the final version of the bill, up or down. Typically, bills that have reached this point have been discussed within the majority and minority parties caucus, during which they discuss strategy, who supports or opposes the bill, and it also gives legislators time to ask questions from research staff if they have any concerns about the final version of the bill up for a vote. If the bill fails, then it can be rescued by a motion to reconsider. However, the member requesting must have been on the majority side of the previous vote. So if a vote fails, someone who voted no must make the motion to reconsider. Someone who voted for the bill, even though it failed, cannot make that motion. Once the bill passes a third read, it's off to the other chamber where it will go through all the same things. A first read, second read, committee hearings, caucus meetings, committee of the whole or consent calendar, a third read, and then transmission to the governor. If changes were made via amendments in the other house, so for example, a Senate bill going to the House or a House bill going to the Senate, where the other body makes an amendment that is disagreed upon, then a conference committee may be put together from members of the House and Senate to reach agreement and have a final bill that will pass both chambers. Once a bill has passed both chambers and any amendments have been agreed upon and voted for, the governor has the opportunity to weigh in, and the bills will be transmitted to his or her office. At this point, the governor can veto a bill, sign the bill making it law, or do nothing. Even if the governor does nothing, the law will still become effective. As well, even if the governor vetoes, the legislature can still override with a 2/3 vote. Once a legislature has conducted all of its business and transmitted all the bills to the governor that they wanted to, they are able to adjourn in what is called, there is a proper pronunciation for it in Latin, but it's most commonly referred to as sine die. Now, once that motion is made and accepted, all bills that were still in the legislative process that have not been transmitted to the governor are now dead. Legislation cannot be passed until the next session unless a special session is called by the governor or the legislature, and this usually occurs after a budget is passed. Since it is one of the most difficult things to get passed, it's usually the last thing that a legislature will deal with prior to sine die. There also may be a flood of very quick votes on bills that want to be passed around that time as well, since the session is ending soon. So what happens now that the House and the Senate have both adjourned? It's a period called interim, the time between sessions. Now, most legislators will go back home to their districts and not live near the Capitol anymore since they are a part-time legislator and are not expected to show up to committees or for votes. However, they do have some ongoing responsibilities in regards to constituency services for individuals in their district, and they will also likely continue drafting bills for the next session. Some members might be assigned to committees to work on specific issues during interim. A joint committee is typically both created by the House and Senate leadership to take consideration of certain specific issues that want to be addressed in the next legislative session. They can hear testimony, hold public meetings, and consider proposals, but they cannot pass bills until the next session. A select committee might also be put together composed of both members of the House and Senate, as well as individuals from the private sector who might have particular experience on a very specific issue. Now, there might also be an ad hoc committee, which is composed of only Senate or House members. They may or may not have members from the private sector. Now, these are typically formed by the president or speaker, but can also be formed by individual legislators who request to do so by the president or the speaker. It is not a particularly busy time for the legislature, but it is equally as important in preparing for the next session. Now we are on to part 2 of this course, focused on how public advocacy actually works. So let's start at a very fundamental point and ask the question, what is public advocacy? It's working in service to a cause to enact a desired change. Now for us at the Coalition, that means dismantling oppression and promoting equity. We do that to help both current survivors who need services and help, and also to do away with the causes of sexual violence and domestic violence in the first place. For others, however, it may be entirely different. Maybe they care about education, the environment. There are many ways to make a change. However, before moving on, it's important to point out that advocacy is only one element of making change in your community. There is electoral change, which is the process of running for office and taking positions of power so that you are able to enact change directly. There is policy, which is the administrative side of power, determining what policies should take effect and how they should actually work in statute. Then there's advocacy, which is lobbying legislators to make specific choices, educating the public, and more. There's organizing, which is getting people together to demonstrate why an issue is important and getting them together to properly leverage their own grassroots power. And then there is direct service. For example, individuals providing services directly to victims of a specific cause. For example, are survivor advocates that work directly with individuals experiencing sexual or domestic violence. Now, when it comes to being an advocate, if you want to be effective, there's 5 things that you can do to get started. The first one is to learn the facts. It's always important that individuals and legislators that you speak with can rely on the information that you provide them, and also that you're able to make that information readily available. Second is to develop the skills and tools you need to advocate. This could be as simple as being comfortable making a phone call to your legislator and knowing how to write quality letters that will convince people of your position. Third, you want to make connections. Chances are, if you care about a cause, there's an organization or coalition out there trying to make that impact right now. As well, you want to make connections with the people in power who can make the changes that you want to see in your community. 4, you want to meet with those affected. You might be affected yourself, but it's always good to meet with the people who are actually experiencing the issue that you want to resolve. And 5th, engage the legislature. Get involved, speak to those with power, and make sure that they know what you care about and are willing to act on it. So among these tools, why is public advocacy so important? Well, for us at the Coalition, it enables us to share our issues and important work, getting in front of the right people to make change. It adds valuable information to the public discussion of what we do, making it fact-based, which is very important because there are typically a lot of stereotypes and misinformation out there that can make it very difficult to achieve a specific change. It empowers decision makers to enact change. And then it's also just a fundamental right that we feel should be exercised. Everyone should feel comfortable making the effort to make an impact in their community, to change it for the better. Now, you might be asking, am I even allowed to advocate? Particularly those who work for a 501c3 nonprofit. Now, while there are a number of rules around how you're allowed to advocate, you are allowed to advocate. So let's go through just a few different ways that you're able to do that. The first one is legislative lobbying. All types of nonprofits are allowed to educate policymakers, the media, and the public about the issues that are important to their mission, as long as it doesn't include information about specific candidates or specific pieces of legislation. This type of advocacy is absolutely critical. Many legislators are not actively involved in the issues that go on in their district. They don't have a lot of time to put their attention in all places, and so making sure you get in front of them and provide them with good information about the issues that they're going to be voting on, you are making a good choice. Second is elections and electioneering. Now, lobbying means working for or against a specific piece of legislation or a ballot measure. Most nonprofits are allowed to engage in a limited amount of legislative lobbying, which can be very important to advance or protect your organization's mission and impact. When there is a big decision being made, it is important that you are able to weigh in and make sure that your mission is protected. As long as you're not speaking out against a specific piece of legislation or ballot measure or candidate, you are safe. And the last is to educate and to inform, which is really what we're doing in the legislative lobbying and electioneering areas, but this is more generally to the public. Nonprofit organizations may engage in nonpartisan voter registration, education, and turnout activities. However, supporting or opposing a specific candidate or set of candidates or a political party is not allowed for 501c3 organizations and is not what we're describing. It's important that it be nonpartisan and focused on educating voters and individuals about your cause. So now that we know what public policy is, how the legislature functions, let's talk about how you directly can make an impact. But before we dive into that, it's important that you know who your legislator is. When you speak to a legislator as a citizen, it is important that you be from their district. They will give you much more time and pay much more attention to what you have to say because you are one of their voters. And indeed, they are responsible to respond to you. Arizona uses a redistricting commission, and they have an online tool for you to find out what district you live in. This is the districts that the ACES DV, Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, head office resides in, Congressional District 6 and Legislative District 24. Now that you know who your legislator is, you're ready to get to work. One of the best and most direct ways is to meet with your legislator, whether in person or over Zoom due to the COVID-19 restrictions. So, when you meet with your legislator, what should you do? Well, you can schedule a meeting with them by calling their office. Typically, you want to have a very specific ask so that the legislator knows why you're coming in to speak with them. So, for example, at the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, we call and ask to discuss our legislative agenda with them so that they know what we're working on this session and can support it and understand it. Now, it can be helpful to go with a friend so that you're not alone. This is perfectly fine, and legislators are very used to it. It's always helpful to practice before you go and make sure that you know what you want to say, how you want to say it, and how you'll respond to a legislator based on how they respond to you. It's important that when you go, you pull both at their hearts and their minds, because contrary to what people think, a lot of legislators, especially if it's a common sense law that will improve our community, want to sponsor those bills. So make sure to make the case for it, and also let them know why it will improve people's lives. And then after that, follow up with a call or letter just to let them know that you are actively watching how they vote regarding the issue that you care about. It can be a powerful way to let legislators know that you're keeping them accountable. So what can you do now? Well, one is you can track bills. All bills are updated constantly on the Arizona Legislature's website, where you can see exactly what bills have been introduced and where they are in the system. This is typically done through the Request to Speak system, which is a very robust system which allows you to use your voice and show your opinion on legislation by registering your opinion publicly. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So what is the Right to Speak, or RTS system, and how does it work? Well, the Request to Speak system allows you online to support or oppose or post a neutral position on a proposed bill. It's a great tracking system online that keeps you up to date on the bills that you care about and influence your mission. Now, you do have to sign up for it the first time at the Capitol in person, but once you have a login, you can track bills and even register to testify in a committee. It's one of the best tools for a busy person unable to go down to the legislature to both follow bills and make your opinion known. In fact, legislators will be able to see your written opinions when they make their votes in committee. This can be a particularly influencing tool on legislators, especially if a bill is controversial and gets a large response. You can see here the public positions for, against, and neutral on the bill. Using the RTS system, if you have a strong opinion, you can register your position through the system, and that record will be made available to the committee when they vote. It's a very excellent way to quickly support or oppose legislation and impact the response in committee if you don't have time to be there. And you can also see where other people stand on bills. You can also testify directly in committee in front of legislators. Now, you can use the RTS system to register to testify, or you can do it in person by submitting the proper forms. While testifying, it's important that you remain respectful, speak succinctly, and answer any questions the legislators may have regarding the bill under discussion. Time allowed for testimony varies, but is usually limited, particularly on bills with a lot of people seeking to testify. Importantly, you do not need to be a professional to speak. Indeed, we frequently work with survivors comfortable sharing their story to provide powerful testimony that will help legislators understand the seriousness of an issue. Now, when you testify, it's similar to when you meet with the legislator. You can schedule through RTS or in person. You want to make sure to have a very specific point to make. It's always helpful to bring a guest for support when you're speaking in front of so many people. You want to make sure you practice before going. You want to make sure you pull at their hearts and minds. And it's always helpful to follow up with the legislators on the committee afterwards. Lastly, and one of the most very important ways that you can make an impact is to vote. Your vote will always be one of the most important ways to enact changes, both for legislators, for initiatives, and all the way down the ballot. It's always important that you not only vote for federal candidates, which are usually very high profile, but also down ballot candidates that make a real impact in your life and in your community. In fact, over 66% of eligible voters turned out in the 2020 presidential election, more than any other election in over 120 years. And we're hoping that that level of turnout will remain. It's very important for communities to be involved in the individuals and laws that govern them. So, how do you register to vote? Well, you can register online through the Secretary of State's website. You can register by mail by downloading a form and printing it out from the Secretary of State's website and sending it to your county recorder's office. You can request a form from your county recorder that they send you in the mail and you send back. Or you can visit in person at your county recorder's office directly. Important to know, when you register, Arizona is a closed primary state, meaning that you must register with the party to vote in their primary. As such, if you want to vote for a Republican in their primary, you need to be registered as a Republican. Same thing as a Democrat. However, if you choose to identify as independent, you will not be allowed to vote in either of the party's primaries. So if you want to vote in a primary, make sure you register with the appropriate party. Important to know, Arizona does have a way for survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence to hide their address because voting records are public information. So if you are registering to vote, you do have that option of privacy. I also want to touch on what you should bring with you when you vote. Now, there's a few forms of primary identification that you can use alone. These include an Arizona driver's license, a U.S. federal, state, or local government issued ID issued with printed name and address, an Arizona ID card, or a tribal enrollment card. Important to know, the address that you are currently registered to vote at must match your ID. Now, if you don't have any of these, there are a litany of other documents that you can use in order to verify your identification, and these are located on the Arizona Secretary of State's website, as you can see. So now that you know how the legislature works, you know what advocacy is, and you have a few tools to engage in it, I want to discuss some of the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence's legislative priorities this year. We have a few categories that we're hoping to address. The first is to access to safe and affordable housing. One of the important bills we want to enter is to expand lease termination options for survivors of violence. So right now, unless you get a court-ordered protection order, you are not able to terminate your lease, which may be very difficult if you are still living with an abuser and you are both still tied to the lease. So we want to expand that to allow advocates from sexual violence and domestic violence organizations to be able to provide a written document that would allow them to terminate their lease. Second, we want to amend state statute to prohibit evictions of crime victims based on nuisance laws. Now, nuisance laws are laws that essentially say that if a property owner hears that police have been called to your residence where you rent a number of times, they are able to evict you because you are a nuisance. This has happened a few times in the state of Arizona and resulted in lawsuits, which is very traumatic for survivors just trying to get police protection. So it's our hope to provide an exemption for crime victims. Under sexual violence services and response, we want to mandate statewide use of an existing sexual assault kit tracking system, specifically because it's online and it allows survivors to anonymously check the status of their sexual assault kit. And we also want to establish a right to know the status of their kit. And in addition to that, we are looking to pass a comprehensive sexual assault survivors Bill of Rights with a litany of important rights for survivors. Under firearm law reform, we want to close gaps that give perpetrators of domestic violence easier access to guns. Specifically, we want to make sure that domestic violence misdemeanants are not able to purchase guns, and that if they already own guns, that there is a process in place for them to surrender those weapons to the proper authorities. Under family law reform, we want to provide the means for sexual assault survivors to maintain safety for themselves and their children. In the state of Arizona, it is required for a survivor to get a conviction of their perpetrator in order to terminate parental rights. Now, this is a very, very high bar, seeing as close to a quarter of instances of sexual assault are reported, and a very small margin of those reported result in conviction. Now, if you do not terminate parental rights, your perpetrator can demand partial custody. Now, we want to change that to a clear and convincing standard, which lowers the bar but still keeps it high, and would allow more survivors to terminate the parental rights of perpetrators of sexual violence. So these are some of the things that we're working on, and we would be happy if any of these stand out to you to have your support. So that has been our course. I hope that you've learned something helpful, and I would encourage you to reach out to me directly at tanner@acesdv.org if you would like to get more involved, meet with your legislator, or do anything that you want to improve your community. Thank you so much for your support and advocacy.